Our speaker this hour is Dan Kessinger. Dan is married to Mary Amy, and they have two sons, Thomas and DJ. Thomas is married to Cheyenne. DJ is married to Brooke, and DJ and Brooke just had a little baby named Archer. So that means Dan and Mary Amy are grandparents for the first time. We're very, very happy for them. I'm setting all joking aside right now to tell you that Dan is one of the most brilliant people I know, one of the most brilliant Bible teachers you'll ever find. And we'll enjoy this lesson from him.
Read the bio in the book, it's a lot better. It's 3:15. You're still here. I appreciate your being here. I know it's a difficult hour. We're going to do the best that we can with it. We got a lot of ground to cover. I'm very grateful to be here to be speaking to you. And I hope that it manages to impart something to you. You're just going to have to try to bear with me. My voice is in a deplorable condition. I'm not sure how it got that way, but here we are. Abraham and his progeny, as sojourners and pilgrims, were in a precarious position. At the respective ages of 75 and 65, they've been called from a land of familiarity, populated and dominated by powerful family members, to a new land. One of a strange culture and race and religion. Presumably, God had called upon them to make that change in order to separate them from a land inundated with idolatry. And although we sometimes focus on the daunting journey that led them on a circuitous route through northern Mesopotamia and eventually into Canaan, this would prove to be only the beginning of their trouble. The Bible tells us that when God called them, the destination was not even clear in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8. By faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a land which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed. And he went out not knowing whither he went, but likely this was just the beginning of trouble. The Bible never explicitly tells us that it was the purpose of God to remove them from idolatry, although it certainly seems reasonable to presume that. And there are a number of factors that we could point to. One is archaeological evidence from Ur indicates that this was a place that is, where I grew up, we'd say it was plumb eat up with idolatry. But then there's also the factor that we know about with Rachel. And when she and her sister and their husband left Haran, the Bible tells us that she stole one of the household gods of her father Laban. Laban was a great nephew to Abraham. And then you have the somewhat ambiguous statement of Joshua chapter 24 and verse 15 to deal with. If it seem evil to you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods that your fathers served, which were on the other side of and the old King James says flood, and almost every other version says river, which was a pseudonym for the Euphrates. And so Joshua is saying, your ancestors in Mesopotamia were idolaters. Now the only question that we have about that is, did that include Abraham and Sarah? And it may have at some point. We don't know. But I do know the family was involved. But what about this new place, Canaan? Well, Abraham and Sarah might have been separated according to God's covenant purpose and promise, but they weren't isolated. And here they were in the midst of yet other tribes who seem equally devoted to idols, which raises the question of their status in Canaan. And it seems reasonable to say this, that if it had not been for God's blessing, these foreign nationals living separately would have been swallowed up, destroyed And it may have only been through God's blessing Abraham with exceeding wealth so much that he was able to have his own private security force. That's the only thing that you could say kept him safe. And here's another factor. Usually, you would form alliances through the covenant of marriage. That was forbidden. When it came time for Isaac to marry, his servant sent back where? Mesopotamia. Well, how does that help us? They're idolaters. The second stipulation was, and she has to come back here. The couple has to live in Canaan. One generation after that, circumstances, more likely providence, arose to get Jacob back to Mesopotamia. And we're not saying the polygamy here is ideal, but it is significant that he marries two girls, not Canaanites. Contrast that, if you will, with what happened to his rejected brother Esau, who marries a succession of Canaanite women, much to the displeasure of his mother and father. In particular, it states that about the two Hittite women he married. And it becomes clear their status here in this place is sojourner, pilgrim, separate. Now, when we consider, as we must, for the purpose of this lesson is about the fear of God among the Philistines. And the Bible student may have more questions than he has answers about the moral condition of the Canaanites at this time. And it may be that what we think is clouded by what we later see. Because the Canaanites of the time of the conquest and later are portrayed as being hopelessly godless, violent, and perverted. But you see, as God revealed to Abraham back in Genesis 15 and verse 16, there would be an interval between when he was speaking to him and when the things he was promised must take place, because, as he said, the sin of the Amorites is not yet full. But in spite of that, Abraham probably had good reason for caution with these people, aside from simple xenophobia. Are there places that do not fear the Lord? Of course. Some of us may have encountered such places at one time or another, and what do we think of as a place that doesn't fear the Lord? Well, where godlessness is common, and where violence is common, especially to those who are strangers and newcomers. And maybe you've had an experience like I have a couple of times of somebody who's a little more streetwise than I am saying to me, no, don't go there. You see, when we think of those who fear the Lord, we think primarily of serving God as a Christian, and I certainly would agree with that, but in the sense that Abraham used it, and that was a phrase that came out of his mouth as he tried to explain himself for the deceit that we're going to talk about in just a moment. I thought there was no fear of the Lord in this place. I think it's a little more general than that. It's the idea that there are some kind of values and what we might call common decency, although I would add to that without specific service to God and without specific guidance to Him, I would argue that common decency quickly becomes uncommon. So now, let's turn our attention to the text. And we begin in Genesis chapter 20. And in Genesis chapter 20, an incident is revealed that, quite frankly, is disappointing. Not only is what is done at this time, not only does it reflect a lack of trust in God, it's also the second time that this harebrained scheme was thought up and executed, and it backfired. You see, you go back a few years when they had first become, Abraham and Sarah had become residents in Canaan. Along comes a famine, and so their solution is we need to leave for a time. They go down to Egypt, and Abraham is concerned that because of the outstanding beauty of his wife, that some random Egyptian is going to take her and kill him. And so they come up with this plan. We're going to tell everyone that she is my sister, or that you are my sister. He has this discussion actually with Sarah, so she evidently goes along with it, and it blew up in their faces. Because, well, she's a sister, says the Pharaoh, and he decides to take her as a wife. And then his house is plagued, and it's revealed to him, you're suffering these things because you have this man's wife. And the Pharaoh is justifiably angry at Abraham over the deception. Okay, so that's what happened. That went down. But a few years later, another famine. This time, they head west to the territory, in Philistine territory, by the way, if you don't know, it's that borders the Mediterranean Sea. So they're heading west toward the Mediterranean Sea, and there they encounter a man named Abimelech. He is identified as king of the Philistines. He is also identified as king of Gerar. Now, I'm going to concede that this is an intimidating situation. But the plan worked so poorly last time, they decided to try it again. And once again, it's, she's my sister. And once again, it backfires. And once again, she is taken by Abimelech and evidently he intends to make her either a wife or a concubine. Now, at this point, we need to take a quick time out and make an observation. Because when you read this, you can get a little exasperated yourself. And you might think, how many times is it going to take for you to learn this lesson? And you say that, and then all of a sudden it hits you. How many times does it take me to learn a lesson? More than twice, it turns out. But the situation also causes us to ask some questions about Abraham. You know, when I read about Abraham, I'm reading about an unwavering giant of faith. It's hard to reconcile the description, for instance, of Romans chapter 4, verses 20 through 22 with this account. He staggered not at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strong in the faith, giving glory to God, being fully persuaded that what he had promised he was able to perform, therefore it was imputed to him for righteousness. And to this, we add the description of Hebrews 11, 8 through 10. By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go into a land which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed. And he went out not knowing whither he went. By faith, he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which hath foundation, whose builder and maker is God. I don't know about you, but when I read this, and I read what's written in Hebrews 11 and Romans 4, it's hard for me to reconcile that giant of faith with what here appears to be a craven deceiver. Too often, we confuse faithfulness with perfection. And when we observe perfection lacking in some individual, we sometimes prematurely and permanently reject and jettison someone. Now, I'm here to tell you, I believe every word in those two texts, Hebrews 11, 8 through 10, and Romans 4, 20 through 22. I believe every word in it. But these were not intended to be a gloss over the errors of Abraham. It turns out that Abraham's like the rest of us. He's human, and he makes mistakes too. So what do we do with Abraham once we learn that? Individual decisions, they do matter. We're not trying to say it doesn't matter when we choose that which is wrong. It does matter. But let it not be said that those define us. They don't have to. We always have the option to return to our normal and typical walk with God. I've read this. You've read this. It is what it is. That doesn't mean Abraham wasn't a believer in God, and that doesn't mean he didn't return to living like one. In this case, Abraham's deceit was revealed in a dream to Abimelech. Well, what God said to him is kind of interesting. I would characterize it as harsh rhetoric, but merciful action. Do you ever secretly wish that you could have a back and forth conversation with God? You know, maybe you don't want to, because in this conversation, it begins like this. You ready? You're a dead man. That's not really what you want to hear from God, is it? The conversation opens with, you're a dead man. Now, the response of Abimelech, I want to show you very quickly three things, and I think it reveals much about him. First off, Abimelech evidently was a believer in God. He did not reply in such a way that would indicate he was unfamiliar with God. I don't know how he learned about God, but he didn't say, well, who are you? He evidently knew who he was. Number two, it's interesting that he spoke not only in his own defense, but also in defense of his people, who he called a righteous nation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Third, Abimelech appealed to the justice of God, saying his was an honest mistake because he'd been misinformed about who Sarah was. Which leads us to this question. Was there fear of God among the Philistines? Now, I mentioned the Canaanites in general a moment ago. Now, what about the Philistines? Of all the people in the Old Testament that the Israelites dealt with, I suppose the Philistines have the worst reputation of anyone. Again, based on what we read from the conquest on. They were the villains in the story of Samson and the stories about the time that Samuel was the judge over the land, and certainly with David. And critics object that this account could not be true because Philistines didn't arrive till quite some time later. In my opinion, what they have to say, instead of contradicting the Bible, actually illuminates it. And here's what I believe is going on. I believe both groups were called Philistines, but perhaps because of the land in which they lived. In other words, I'm not even convinced they were related. They might have been, but there was an earlier group that lived there. Now, I want you to notice one of the major differences. It was the way that their government was organized. Here's Abimelech. He's called the king of the Philistines, king of Gerar. Later times, the Philistines are ruled by an organized 5 lords over the 5 cities. And I'm convinced that the later Philistines did not share the same values as the earlier ones. And I believe that accounts for it. Now, I also want you to know, I'm not prepared to give a blanket endorsement of Abimelech. And for example, for our consideration, I'm using one principle. The Bible view of women. Bible critics often make a blanket accusation regarding the Bible. I can't tell you how many times I've read it that goes something like this. The Bible endorses the idea that women are only property, which is a statement you can only make if you've never read the Bible. All you have to do is read about Abraham and Sarah, and you'll see how foolish that is. Sarah, very model of submission. At the same time, man, she could put her foot down and she could make demands. She had a brain. She was a human being. She wasn't trying to usurp authority. But just a little while ago, it was mentioned to us from Rick, he was talking about that incident with Hagar and Ishmael. When it came time, she said, I want that woman out of our house. I know that tone of voice. And so do you, husbands. She wasn't property. My property didn't talk to me that way. On the other hand, here's Abimelech. I would argue that his view of women isn't endorsed in either testament. Now, while he rejected the sins of adultery and murder and rape, as we'll see later, he still thought that Sarah, if she were unmarried, was a commodity. Now, from this, we need to segue into a principle that I hope will illuminate that one. And that is the idea that it is a tenuous exercise and probably a fool's errand to try to go back in time, as a lot of us are doing in America today, as moralists bent on retro condemnation. What do you mean, retro condemnation? Well, let's give a couple of examples. 1940s, Americans justifiably viewed the enemies of World War II as enemies. But here's the question, were they all godless? Seemed like an easy answer at the time, especially the nations of Japan and Germany. Now, here's the question. If you have a 19-year-old who enlisted in the German army, is it possible he didn't do that because he hated Jews or that he'd been told he was protecting the homeland? By the way, this does not apply to those who created the architects of Hitler's final solution, nor does it excuse anybody who carried out an atrocity, and it doesn't even excuse fighting for the Wehrmacht. I think that does qualify as bad behavior. All I'm asking is this. Can you automatically say they're all godless? There's no fear of God. Well, as our own soldiers found out at the end of the war, as they met them, they seemed like many of them were honorable and decent. A more provocative example is that of slavery. Again, I have absolutely zero doubts about the ethics of slavery. Perhaps it was best expressed by Abraham Lincoln, who said, as I would not be a slave, I would not be a master. He says, this to me expresses the idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of that difference, is no democracy. Now, he did two things in that statement. He alleged that no real democracy could be, and inasmuch as it endorsed slavery, he also paraphrased Luke chapter 6 and verse 31, and what you would have men do to you, do you also unto them likewise. That's what's meant by, as I would not be a slave, I would not be a master. But today, what we're doing, many of us, we're going back into history. We're going back to a time not that long ago when slavery was the norm around the world, not the exception. That doesn't justify it, by the way. But it's just an observation. And we're saying anybody who owned a slave has no fear of God and is to be dismissed, or as we say, canceled. And so all those who were responsible for the United States, you're done. Done. Gone. It's the unforgivable sin. Does it matter how George Washington treated his slaves? Does it matter that he expressed a desire to free them? Does it matter that some taught slaves the gospel which they heard and believed? What is thought by some is the answer to all those questions is no, and therefore it is a tainted relationship, and so we reject the God that they claim and the Bible that they consulted. And I'm saying, while no endorser of that, they were misled by the status quo of their generations. And to this we add this historical fact, that freed blacks sometimes owned slaves. Now, to be fair, some of these were bought just for the purpose of freeing them, others purely as a matter of commerce. Now, does that justify it? No. But it tells you what the world was like at the time. It's very easy for us to go back and talk about what others would have done. It is doubtful in some of these cases that we ourselves would have done better. So what's that have to do with all this? We actually have two people, Abimelech and Abraham, who feared God, but who did so with flaws. No, Abimelech should not have captured Sarah, wife, sister, whatever. He shouldn't have done that. And again, he clearly viewed her as a commodity. No, Abraham should have trusted God rather than doing what he did. Unfortunately, that's not the way it worked out. By the way, Abraham is still trying to mitigate his responsibility when he explains, after he's explaining why he did this to Abimelech. Well, I thought no fear of God here, and besides that, well, technically you could say she is my sister because she's my half-sister, and it's doubtful that either Abimelech or God accepted that explanation. As flawed as they were, he sends them away with gifts. Oh, by the way, they were subjected to what I consider to be a heavy dose of sarcasm. When he gives the gifts to Sarah, I really would like to hear a tone of voice. That's always helpful in determining sarcasm. When he says, give these to your brother, he probably said it like that, your brother indeed. Well, time is ticking away quite quickly. I don't know if I need to cut or talk faster. I'll try talking faster. But in the next section, that is Genesis chapter 21, verses 22 through 34, we have a covenant. And this actually we will talk about quite quickly. Abimelech comes to Abraham and he proposes a covenant, a treaty. And it's interesting that he's the one that initiates this, because at the time, Abraham's status would have posed no real threat to the king of the Philistines. But nonetheless, he proposes it. The second thing is it's a very humble treaty in that it only asks for consideration, and there's no real promise of anything to Abraham and his family, although it's possible that there was an implied reciprocity. But what about this covenant? Well, a couple of things. Number one, it presupposes the existence of God and the notion that he providentially blesses or curses people on this earth. Now, I doubt that Abraham shared the specifics of Genesis chapter 12 with him, especially verse 3. I will bless them that bless thee, curse him that curseth thee. I doubt that he shared that with him because there were some rather unpleasant implications perhaps for Abimelech. But nonetheless, Abimelech recognized, here's a man of God that God is blessing, and the more I bless him, the more I myself will be blessed. Now, the second thing you will notice is, if you're going to engage in such a treaty, there is an expectation of ethical treatment of the terms. So in the mind of Abimelech, he's saying, I can trust Abraham with this treaty because Abraham's a man of God. It had been revealed to him in that dream from God. He is my servant. He is my prophet. Abimelech evidently believed that. Likewise, Abraham believed, evidently, that Abimelech was a man of his word. Now, based on that understanding, Abraham raises a grievance. And the grievance was that without Abimelech's knowledge or consent, that some herdsmen had captured some of the wells that Abraham had dug. And so they worked all this out. Now, all this happened at Beersheba. And that's a place with an interesting etymology. The word beer means well, and the word Sheba can either mean seven or oath. And you wonder which one, and it's impossible to tell because both are valid. There was a sacrifice of 7 sheep, and obviously it was an oath. So either Beersheba is the well of the oath or the well of the 7. It's even possible that this was a form of double entendre, and it actually means both at the same time. But there's one principle I want to explore before we get on to Isaac in the time that I have remaining. And that is this notion. The fact that Abraham was able to make this agreement with Abimelech, it stands in contrast to the actions of some of his descendants many years later. You know, Jesus had as much conflict over the principle of fraternization as any one thing. You eat with sinners. Well, here's Abraham, who believed, evidently, that he could converse with, that he could even make an agreement with a man who was not part of the family of God. And I think that's a great contrast. All right, let's talk about Isaac. Verses 1 through 33, Genesis chapter 26. Well, once again, Isaac finds himself subject to a famine. And like his father, he goes to the same place. And like his father, worried about the outstanding beauty of his wife, Rebekah, they decide to tell everyone, she is my sister. And once again, we think, how many times are we going to try this? And I'm not sure. Now, a couple of background notes. There are some who doubt the validity of this story, because how could this be the same man, Abimelech, an estimated 60 or 70 years after the previous incident? Well, there are 2 possibilities. Number one, Abimelech may have been a title rather than a personal name, but I don't think that's the explanation. I think the explanation is this. We're dealing with elevated lifespans. We're always impressed with the lifespans of the antediluvians. You know, Adam at 930, Jared at 962, Methuselah at 969. But even after the flood, people continued to live an extended period. Abraham 175, Isaac 180. Jacob 147. Many generations later, here's Moses 120, but in wonderful physical condition at that age. And I think it is presumptuous to assume that this was only true of the family of God. It appears that the lifetimes were still being extended. Later it'll level off to a more familiar span, but at this time it is certainly within the realm of possibility that this is the same Abimelech, and I think there's another reason to think that. And when we combine that with the fact that on both occasions he's accompanied by his right-hand man, Philcol. So either these are the same two men, now grown old, or I don't know, do we think that there were only like 10 or 15 names in all Philistia and everybody had to wear the same name as his father? I find that just a little bit unlikely. But anyway, on this occasion, let me back up a little bit. I need to talk about Egypt. I'm going to do it quickly because I really am running out of time. On this famine, before it actually hit, they received a warning. God reaffirmed his promise, but he also warned them against going to Egypt. Now, Egypt's familiar territory. Abraham had gone there. Joseph will famously go there. And, you wonder why was he forbidden to go to Egypt? And I believe it might be because of the later significance of Egypt. Egypt represented for God's people not just a bondage, it represented the bondage. Is what the Passover was about. You read in Jeremiah 31 and verse 32 how that God took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You read it, Deuteronomy 26 verses 67 and 68, that it was the place to which the Israelites would be sold in a final humiliation if they continued to be disobedient to God. And in the New Testament, in Hebrews chapters 3 and 4, it becomes a symbol for us. Those of us who want to live for God today are in the wilderness. We hope to cross the Jordan into the promised land. We don't want to go back to the land of slavery, to the land of sin. Back to Isaac and Rebekah. This time, it's Abimelech himself who discovers how that he has been deceived. And I think that we can miss what actually happens here if we don't do some thinking. It was said that he looked out of his window and saw Isaac showing, out of a window, and saw Isaac showing endearment to his wife. That's a kind of a discreet wording used by the King James. Other versions are a little more explicit. You understand what it means. They're maintaining a public facade that we are siblings. And let's just say there's certain kinds of touching that are to be expected, normal and good, between a husband and wife that are not appropriate elsewhere. But see, here's what I think is happening. The Bible doesn't say that Abimelech was performing clandestine surveillance, but I think that he was, based on his previous experience with the family. Now, if you're trying to maintain that facade, you're going to do that sort of thing where you are confident that nobody can see. I don't think that he was sitting there reading his morning paper, drinking his coffee. I guess if there were morning paper, you'd have to read it like that, wouldn't you? But anyway, this wasn't a random sighting. There's a lot of people who could have seen him. It's no coincidence that it was Abimelech. He was following them. And when he saw it, his reaction shows his ironclad moral code. Because you see, his first concern was that, as he said, somebody might have taken her and brought condemnation and a curse on this nation. But even that tells you the ethics were not as they should be. Why? Because presumably Rebekah would not have been complicit with a sexual tryst. So what he was worried about amounts to sexual assault. Well, once again, there's the conflict. Once again, there's Abimelech, these many years later, having discovered this. And it causes me to ask a question. Is it possible that the people of God might curse principled people by their own unethical behavior? And I think we know what the answer is. Of course it is. It could be that you can bless principled people by ethical behavior. About 15 years ago, I had a man knock on the door of my study, and he said, I'd like for you to, well, he didn't say I'd like for you to baptize me. He said, I want to get into your church. So I said, well, I think we need to have a conversation first. He sat down. He was in his mid-90s. Couldn't see very well and couldn't walk very well. But he told me the strangest story. Many years before, he'd had a conflict with a neighbor. And that neighbor was a child of God. He was in the Lord's church. And the problem became quite contentious. But as the years went by after the conflict, something kept bothering this man. And what he told me was, that man was treating me so well and I was treating him so poorly. And he said, many years ago, I need to be in the church that man is in. Well, it took 60-some years before I got the knock on the door. And literally, he was ready to do whatever I told him. He couldn't even read the verses himself. His eyes were so bad, I had to read him the Bible verses. Never had a situation like that one. I baptized him. He lived as much for the Lord as he could in the few years that he had after that. But that was a case of somebody blessing someone, and I don't even know who it was. I never did get a name. But somebody blessed that man by ethical behavior. I think Isaac's sojourn might have been a little better had he been a little more open and honest. The bulk of Genesis chapter 26 consists of a series of events, including Isaac making yet another agreement with Abimelech. But before we get there, real quickly, he was there in the valley of Gerar, and Abimelech and his servants saw how God was prospering him. The Bible says they were envious, asked him to move on. And so he moved a little farther away, and there we learn about the wells of Abraham that had been previously claimed. Now they've been filled in. And in a land like that, I'm pretty sure that would be considered vandalism and sabotage. But Isaac began to redig them. He dug one, they took it. He dug two, they took that one. He dug a third, and he was able to keep it. And I think it's because it was too far away for him to notice or wasn't practical for them to reach. I'm not sure which of the two it was. But folks, all these conflicts remind us of the precarious position they were in. And here's what I want you to know. God could have given that land to Israel without having these 3 generations stay there as strangers and pilgrims. I'm certain God had the ability to do that, but He was teaching us something. What was it? Hebrews 11, verse 13. These all died in faith, not having received the promise, but having been persuaded of them and embraced them and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. That's a great lesson. It was the lesson of Abraham. It was the lesson of Isaac. Now, eventually Abimelech returns, and they make what you might consider to be a renewal of the covenant. But as I close, I want to make this observation that we have a responsibility to those who fear God, or maybe they haven't got quite that far yet. What is our responsibility? Well, number one, James 1:27, pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this: to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. We must honor the New Testament principles of fellowship. But that doesn't mean shunning those who are made in God's image. Some of them want to fear God, and they don't know how. And some of them don't know that they ought to want to fear God. Our responsibility is to do the right thing ourselves. But as much as possible, lend our influence to them that they might also live for God. I mentioned slavery a moment ago. Slavery is where we find ourselves so long as we're apart from the Lord. But it's a slavery from which we have been redeemed. If you're not a child of God, we're going to sing a song to invite you to become a Christian. Jesus said, "He that believes and is baptized shall be saved." Saved, free. In this case, those are the same things. You want to be free? You want to be part of God's family? Will you come as we stand and sing?